Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show with another interview for the month of October. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe, and today we have our first stories interview for the month of October. Now, my guest is an attorney and author in Philadelphia, and my guest's first book was Devil's Music, Holy Rollers, and Hillbillies: How America Gave Birth to Rock and Roll. And it's a very interesting book because it deals with a period in history that really doesn't get a lot of scholarship. Then this also led to the follow up book, Rock Music Authority and Western Culture, 1964 to 1980s. And according to reviewers, the vivid, perceptive prose captures the visual impact of rock music, and there's always a compelling look at why, how, and where rock and roll moved us. And in addition, he's also published legal scholarship on children's rights and the Constitution and has written on music related topics as a regular contributor to PopMatters since 2013 and elsewhere. And to tell us all about his role as an attorney and independent scholar and historian, as well as his two books, let's give a huge round of applause to a first timer here on the show, Mr. James Cosby. James, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hey, Gabriel, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
No problem. So before we dive into your background, is there anything else you would like to share with the viewers and listeners?
Well, as far as the intro, I think you covered it. You got the two books, and there's sort of two parts. There's standalone books, and there's a third one that'll come. It's sort of a trilogy, but they're sort of standalone books, and it's a trilogy of rock and sociology.
Nice. So let's actually talk about your two books, which honestly the titles are very, very captivating and really hook you in. So how did those two books um come out into well, I should say this. What led to the creation of two of these books, and what is so important about the history these books are telling us?
Right. Well, so it started. I've been doing some other legal academic writing, and but I was I'm a lifelong rock fan, and there was just a point where I was looking back at rock music and thinking what a huge impact it had on my life, like on a direct impact,
Mhm.
And I had these questions in the back of my mind, like how did rock music even start, and I think
Mhm.
a lot of people, it was like there was black people being treated bad in the South. They made the blues, and then Elvis came along, and there was rock and roll. I didn't know a whole lot more beyond that, really. And so I just started looking into it deeper and deeper, and it just got more and more interesting every step of the way. And then it just clicked. It's like, well, if I don't know the answer, like what was the first rock record? Did somebody invent it? What was the deal with Elvis? Was he a
Mm.
cultural thief? Was he racist? Like, or why do I not know the answers to these questions? And
Nice.
yeah, so that got me, and then it just clicked. Like I want to write a book on this, and so that just got me started, and it just took off.
Interesting. Now, regarding your second book, you focus on from 1964 and 1980s. Why specifically that time frame for your second book?
Um, well, basically, the first wave of rock and roll had clearly ended, and there's the first wave, Elvis, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, all those guys, that had clearly ended by 1960 for one thing. Like it's a very clear line, and then the Beatles and the British invasion start in 1964, and that classic rock era, as people kind of refer to it now, there was so much social upheaval. It
Mm.
just, it just went hand in hand. How this upheaval of the '60s played out, and by 1980, punk and hip hop have already just started, which would kind of takes you into the third stage. But the classic rock era had kind of blown up in the 60s. And it was sort of going in different directions in the 70s, but it's sort of a clear delineation before punk and hip hop especially kind of kick in.
Nice. And I had the opportunity to look at the beginning of the second book and just read and just understand. And there's a lot of history that you cram into it, but it flows very nicely, and it tells this sort of like forgotten history that we really don't take into consideration, how music is ingrained in other aspects of American culture, which I honestly find very, very fascinating, and love those types of stories where we really see that, hey, this connects to this connects to that. So it's really, really powerful. So going now to you as an independent scholar and historian, were you always fascinated with history growing up, or did that come about later around the same time as when you were penning the drafts to your books?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I wasn't like a big history person growing up so much. No, I mean, I guess a lot of things changed just as I, was growing up and like I said, I was doing some academic scholarship, and so that required doing some research, historical research, and so how did we get to where we are, and that's such a funny thing, and even today you look around, it's everybody knows if you don't learn history you repeat it, but we repeat it all the time anyway,
Yes.
But I think it really is that, it's like, I can see things happening today. It's like, oh, this started back in this, in this, you can see where it started back here in the 60s and 70s.
Definitely, 100%. So now going more into your background as a scholar and historian, as well as an author and writer. So for both, what were your goals that you had in mind, and first going with your books and also with your academic writing? And the reason I bring this up is I'm always curious as to what are the individual goals that we historians have, because sometimes they're general or sometimes they're more specific.
Right. Yeah, I started, I really felt like there's so much history that is so basic that we don't know. Like everybody loves rock and roll. Basically, it's not like big as it used to be, but still, basically, everybody loves rock and roll.
Right.
Very few people don't like rock, or hate rock and roll. And yet, there was so much of this history, like, and it ties into race, it ties into morality, religion, and anti-religion, and all these things. And so I just really wanted to shed light on it. It just seemed like that's always a good thing. And and Elvis is called the obvious example, like, just shedding some light on what does his legacy really mean to us. And it seems really important because I think there's a lot of really distorted views of what Elvis represents and who he was, for just using Elvis as a obvious example. So I just felt like there's a lot of these areas that are important to shed light on, so we understand race better, for example.
Definitely 100%. And also using like Elvis as like a focal point in history. As you said, like, whenever we think of like, generally speaking, when people think of like the history of rock and roll, they begin with like, Elvis and like how he started this new trend of music and what did he represent. And then, of course, with the Beatles, what did they represent during their time and the history around them? It is very fascinating to see how music is intertwined with, as said in the beginning, culture, politics, and other aspects of American history that people really don't take into consideration, but it is, very, very apparent. And so when writing these two books and sort of crafting the history for both, what was the initial feedback like from readers, friends, and family, as well as fellow academics that you may have shared these books with?
It's all, I don't know. It's all been really positive. I think it's funny. I think there were a few people at the beginning I talked to would say, Like, hasn't people already written about rock and roll? Like, you know, why would you even kind of like why would you even bother? It's already been written about.
Right.
And but I think it's sort of been was made the right decision. I mean, I think it really is this area that really got overlooked. As far as far as the origins of rock and roll with the first book, and you know, like I said, like people, there's lots have been written about the blues. There's been lots of been written about 50s rock and roll, and how that's usually the starting point, and but to connect all these dots in between gospel and the Delta, the Mississippi Delta, and even going back to slavery and tying all these dots together, it just really hadn't been done before. And so I think it's gotten a really strong response that this was a niche that was pretty much overlooked. And I think
Definitely 100%. And you actually brought up something which actually is very, very true. And actually kind of leads to the next question, which, as you said, how, some people's reaction was, well, why did you write that? I mean, we've already have books on, the history of rock and roll. We have like an understanding of the history. But from what you're telling me, James, it's like, no, the history is a lot bigger than what we've originally believed. This connects to this ties into this. The history has been, as some would say, probably condensed into what we have understood to be the history of rock and roll. But like history, in all things, there are some aspects that are tied to the main branch. And ultimately, when crafting new historiographies, there is a little sense of, intimidation, anxiety if, people are going to be open-minded to, this new research, this new study, or new books on a topic that people may believe has already been talked about and researched enough. So when you were crafting these two stories, did you sort of have that sense of anxiety or imposter syndrome? Or if not, what disciplined you to write not just the second book, but also plan a third book in this history series of rock and roll?
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, yeah, at the beginning it is daunting, and it's like, why, there's lots of really highly skilled, highly trained historians out there, great writers writing this stuff. Why should I even put my voice into that? And again, I think at first it really was just a gut feeling, like I was doing this research, and I just didn't see I wasn't really seeing the answers to my questions. Like I was finding bits and pieces of it in different places. So I really felt confident, like this is a book that, I would read, like if I saw it on the shelves, I would buy it, and then I think I just started to, like, once I got going on that and I got some really good feedback, it's sold at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's sold at Sun Studio in Memphis, which is like a historic landmark. And then it's just got my confidence. Now it's like, okay, I think I'm onto something. I'm doing something here that's it is original, or it's worthwhile. And so that really got me going with that.
Definitely. And I think you bring up something that a lot of, independent historians, struggle with and sort of really have to overcome. I've talked with a lot of previous guests who have written, similar books, written their own books, and there is that sense of, daunting or intimidating factor when you try to write your own piece on a topic that you're interested in a broad historiography or broad scholarship. And again, there is that nervousness to sort of test your mettle and to show, I know what I'm talking about. I've done the research. I know this history just as much as, other people in this field. So there is that little intimidation from, as one person said, the gatekeepers of certain scholarships, which can deter, independent historians from pursuing a field of interest that, is really enticing to them. And on the topic of independent historians, I was going to turn over to you, James, and if you could share with us, your experiences as independent historian and scholar, and what you have learned while crafting these stories, and how they have helped you understand the history field a little better, or even differently.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough to get your voice out there. Whereas if I was a professor somewhere, I got with a small independent publisher, which was enough, to get like a foothold, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
To have a little bit of credibility there for going forward. So that's really been huge, but it's still tough. It's really tough, and I don't really have guarantees that that's one thing is this first book. Like I had no guarantee it was getting published.
Mm.
I mean, I've published legal academic a couple of larger articles. So, but for a book there was no guarantee it was going to get published. But so there's a leap of faith, I guess, and kind of have to stick with it and sort of believe that what you're doing is a quality product. But yeah, it's a tough business for sure.
Definitely, it is. And I also, as a writer, it is very tough, and also intimidating of whether or not your book's going to be picked up, if it's going to be read, or people going to be interested in the topic that you drafted and worked on for hours and hours, if not months and years. Because that's another thing too, viewers and listeners. As historians, like when we craft our own reference books, or books that we believe could be used for another person's research, it's a very daunting journey, because we ourselves are spending hours and hours and putting time and effort into a topic that we are passionate about, and we are putting it out there. And there is that, as you said before, this nervousness if it is going to get picked up. But ultimately, this goes into something that we'll touch on later, is what are the goals you had with your research? Did you do this solely for profit or gain, or did you do it to enhance and further the scholarship? And that'll be touched on a little bit later. But within now this transition, we're now going to talk about now the business side of being an historian as well as being an author. So, James, you mentioned just now, in addition to writing your 2 books, you've also have a background in academic writing and writing legal work. So, what was sort of like the transition and mentality from academic writing to sort of reference writing for the history of rock and roll? Was it sort of like the same process? Because in a way it is academic, but the level of academic language varies between the two.
Yeah, I'm really glad that with the law background, it really helped me be very structured and very structured basically, and so that helped. So then going into rock, an area that it's a very different subject matter for sure, but it was as far as like a transition, it went pretty smoothly, I think, because I think I was able to. I had it in my head. Okay, this is how I write. I was very structured, and now it's a totally different subject matter. So it's again, it's like just marrying the two. This something that's like kind of a more fun topic like rock music, although it is serious. It is. I'm trying to like marry this conversational style and more scholarly.
Right, definitely. And I also think for both have like an audience in mind for both your academic writing as well as your 2 books. And I said this numerous times on the show, viewers and listeners, but the audience is important. Yes, we are the target audience because we know the book, we know the history, we know what we're writing about better than anyone else. But when writing for other people, we really have to take in consideration who the audience is. So, James, this is sort of a 2-part question. So the first part is, how important is it to understand your audience, both for the academic legal side as well as your rock and roll history side? And also, when you were writing the first book and then before going into the second book, did you have an established idea of who your audience was?
Yep, good question. The first part is, let's see. So yeah, just thinking about the audience, and yeah, it's a really great point that I can write the most amazing whatever, the best story ever, but if if it doesn't make sense to the reader, if I don't make it so they can follow along and get something, like, it doesn't matter, right? It's like, I might think, well, come on, you're not paying attention, or you're not, whatever, you're not, you missed the point. It's like my job to make sure they don't miss the point. And in law, I guess that's, in law, that's sort of the case where you're trying to persuade somebody. You can't,
Right.
You can't just say, well, hey, it's not my fault. I explained, I made a great argument. It's all about how the other person's gonna receive it and understand it. So yeah, I think if that answers your question, like I was, and yeah, and then I guess also the audience. In some ways, I had like a really broad audience in mind. Not everybody wants to read, it's not an academic book, but it's somewhat academic, scholarly.
Right.
So I feel like it's a potentially a really broad topic, and I had that in mind. I kind of had in mind like a serious long-time rock fan who knows some of this stuff already, but also just somebody who's just more somebody's just interested in American history, which that covers a lot of ground also.
Definitely. And kind of within the audience, you also have the reader, which is, in my opinion, very different from the audience. Yes, the target audience is almost like, either the broad group or a very specific niche, but the reader is, ultimately the person who's going to pick up the story. And I've had people sort of answer this question in the sense of that, I wrote this for a reader who was interested in history. They're not full-blown, historians, but this at least gets them interested in the topic. Well, that's kind of like the same thing for your two books, James, how, as you said, they were not entirely academic, but they do entice the reader to hopefully learn a little bit more about the history of rock and roll.
Yeah. I definitely had in mind a few different people in mind. I probably had specifically in mind like a younger, not academic, but like a serious reader, somebody who reads regularly, and not necessarily academic wise, but just like regular readers just likes to read, and is interested in American society, and kind of, I think most people get that rock and roll is a major phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I was thinking of that person, and then I was also, like I said, very much thinking of like the 50 to 60-year-old longtime rock fan, grew up listening to Led Zeppelin and whoever, and Guns N' Roses, and then like a more serious academic also at the same time.
Right. And now going more into the research side, getting the information, getting the primary and secondary sources. So going to your first book, James, what was probably the one piece of research that you uncovered that really took you by surprise? And if it did, sort of shatter any preconceived notions you had on the subject?
Right. Yeah, that's really good. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of things that really surprised me. Like that's like every step of the way, really, it was like, what?
Mm-hmm.
And then going back to slavery, and it's like, this is crazy. But the one thing it's really funny you ask is there was a point where I'm just doing some reading what's out there, and a couple of times there was a mention of like Elvis Presley was raised Pentecostal. Now at that time, and this is like in the mid 2000s, I guess, when I'm doing this research, my understanding of Pentecostalism was very vague. And these are the guys, if people aren't familiar, these are the people that it's a Christian denomination. It was very much in the poor in the South, was where it took off in the 30s and 40s and 50s.
Mm-hmm.
people speak in tongues, where they speak in the tongues, which is that unintelligible language, and they like stream of consciousness. People roll in the church aisles, like because they're slain in the Holy Spirit, and hence the name, the sort of derogatory name, Holy Rollers.
Mm.
And so to me at the time, I was like, oh, those are those crazy people. You know, that's essentially what I thought. I don't really think that now, but so I read, and so first somebody, you know, someone had written like, well, Elvis was raised Pentecostal. Like, well, that's really weird. Like the guy who's the king of rock and roll, supposedly. And then I read some more. It was like Little Richard was raised Pentecostal. Like what? Like Little Richard, like that really exciting performer. And then it was Jerry Lee Lewis was raised Pentecostal. And then I also went back further, and a little before that, there was this gospel singer from the 30s and 40s named Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who's actually really become really well known in the last 10, 15 years. I maybe had a tiny part of that, not that much. But and she was Pentecostal. She was like the godmother of rock and roll. It's a amazing guitar player. And yeah, and you know, if you see her on YouTube, it's like unbelievable. It's like in a,
All right.
Yeah. And so it just hit me like, holy crap, like Pentecostalism is like right at the core, like not even just gospel, but like Pentecostalism is like really at the core of rock and roll as we understand it today. And that was like shocking to me.
Fascinating. I have never heard about this, but then again, that's the beautiful thing about history. You always uncover, you know, something new, and it really opens your eyes and understanding to, again, as I said before, a new pathway to explore and research history. And that leads to the next question, which is now crafting the overall narrative. So when you were gathering your research, James, in the beginning, were you a little intimidated of whether or not you could actually craft this narrative from the first book, as well as continue with the second book? Because to get all the primary and secondary sources and to figure out, okay, what's actually been talked about, what's kind of interesting, but not really what I need. Like, how did you sort of, you know, find a balance between what sources am I actually going to use and what sources can I list as, like, you know, reference material?
You know, at the beginning, I really had a really good outline. Actually, at the very beginning, I thought it was going to be one big book. You know, and because I kind of didn't, you know, I didn't really know,
right,
what it would end up being, and so I had a pretty good outline from the beginning, from start to finish, and that helped a lot as far as, because I knew at that point I knew what I wanted to cover. I'd done a lot of reading, and I kind of knew where I was going with it. So I don't know, as far as, you know, separating the sources, there's a ton of stuff out there on rock music, you know, so it wasn't like a lack of resources, or it wasn't hard to find topics, you know, as they came up.
right.
The opposite, that there was so much out there.
And interesting. All right. And now this kind of leads into another question, which I am very interested to hear your opinion on, James. And it's a question it's a pretty loaded question. So I'll give you some background for this. So the one question I love sharing with, you know, historians and authors is sort of like, you know, this notion of what I call the two path, which is to be an historian and to be known as a historian, because in my opinion, both are two very different things. To be a historian is an individual dedicated to the art of, you know, the discipline, the scholarship, helping the scholarship grow, and not really motivated by capital, but it's nice to receive it now and then. To be known as an historian is an individual dedicated to the art of marketing, their research, their work, their thesis, whatever, on different platforms, let people know this is what I've done, this is what I've researched, and this is what I've uncovered. Now, both have their own trials and errors, their own hurdles, but after doing this now for about 2 years, I've come to the understanding that a lot of first-time historians, and by first-time historians, my viewers and listeners, referring to historians who are right out of college, fresh out of the academic world, and now going into either the private sector or the public sector in like museums, government work, whatever. And then realizing that, yes, they've worked on this in college, and even if it is, the best work they ever conceived, that doesn't guarantee their legacy as an historian in the sense they're going to reach the status that they are trying to achieve. It can be achieved, but to think that it's going to happen overnight, it's not going to happen. There are some exceptions, of course, to that rule, but more than not, you have a rise, fall, and rise again. And it always goes back to what were the goals you had going into this field of study, the research you put into your work, and going out into the public sector. So, James, I was wondering if you could provide your own insight into this, and also you can use examples of your background as an attorney, if that's also come about with people fresh out of law school thinking that, oh, I'm going to be this, but realizing there's hurdles, there's trials if you want to be this type of lawyer or this type of lawyer.
Yeah. Let's see. So for the writing, as a historian, my goals, really it's pardon me, I want to sell 1 million books.
Yes.
I have not yet done that. But I think I've had to be like I really do want to get this stories out there. Like there's a message in there that I think is helpful. And I really think it's a mix. I mean, there's a part of me, that wants to, be on the bestseller list and whatever, do book signings everywhere and all that. And but I've had, there's no guarantee. And I've learned there's zero guarantee that that's really going to happen. The way, like I'm not making a living off writing, to say the least. And that's okay, but I kind of had to be okay with that and keep doing it anyway. So I don't know if I don't know why I have that motivation exactly. But I've definitely, kind of accepted that I may not achieve that, but it really isn't necessarily a knock on my writing either. It doesn't necessarily mean it, it's, there's different reasons why that may or may not happen.
Definitely.
And also I do kind of believe that, you don't really know, like down the road, the next book could blow up and then you get it, then people look at your other writing that you've already done and maybe, so things can take off kind of that way also. That's always out there.
That's actually, very true. And that's the same thing that I've always said. And you've actually mentioned, a lot of the same thing that everyone has to this question, which is, very, very true, is that we all want to make a living off of our writing, off of our books. That is the dream job, to just work on our writing, to live off of the success of our books. And it is possible, it is achievable, but it takes time and a lot of work and a lot of effort. As one guest said on my show, grit transforms into talent, because as time goes on, as the more books we write, our writing gets better, and it may be our 20th book that may get our name out there to our audience, to our readers. And when that does happen, we can show them the history of our writing through our previous books. And that is completely fine. And just as you said, James, just now, it's like, coming to terms with, not going to make a living off my writing, and, that's okay. It's nothing to do with, my skills as a writer, my skills as an author. It's just, I've come to realize that at this point right now, I'm not going to make a living off it, but that is completely okay. And it also helps when you have a good group of people who guide you and provide you different avenues and aspects, which leads now to a fun topic, which is networking, especially as an historian and especially as an historian who's also an author. So, James, I was wondering if you could tell us about your networking experience and if there's other people you want to give a shout out to who have helped you on your journey as an independent scholar, historian, and author.
Let's see. I don't know. I'm not really, I think if I was in academia, I was at a university, it'd be a little different. I have been part of the American Pop Culture Association and gone to conferences. Been to a few conferences, which has been good, and met people in the academic fields, and I think that's been a big help. They have conferences like regional and national conferences every year, and so that's good. Otherwise, I don't know if my networking, it's a lot of like reaching out to people in places like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or Sun Studio.
Okay.
So I don't know if I'm really in a network like that. I guess I would like to be. I mean, I talk to podcasters and I don't know if I have a real network like that.
Okay, that's fair. That's completely fair. And actually, speaking of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, can you tell us your experience with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, especially as you said earlier, your book is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, correct?
Yeah, it's sold there. Yep.
Nice. So, what was your reaction to that when you found out that your book was being sold at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? I mean, that's a pretty huge accomplishment.
Yeah, thanks. And I'd put Sun Studio right along with that, because Sun Studio, really, to me, no knock on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but like Sun Studio's like, that's like, whatever, Valhalla or something like that, the Mecca, and so which is in the Sun Studios where BB King, Howlin' Wolf, and then Elvis or Ike Turner, and then Elvis. Jerry Lee Lewis, that's really where rock and roll blew up for the first time. That's in Memphis, like a beautiful little studio, real small mom and pop studio, and it just blew up. It's a real historic for rock history. That's kind of right with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So those two, I kind of think of them together, and you just super validating. Super validating. People definitely know what they're talking about, know what they're doing. Kind of saw some worth in what I was doing.
Nice. That's actually pretty huge. And I think for me, being a classical historian, I would probably get the same, feeling, reaction, a sense of validation if I wrote a piece of work set in the classical era and it was being sold at like one of the most prestigious museums in Europe or even here in the States, or Smithsonian, which was for a long time my dream job to either work there as a researcher or an archivist. But I can't imagine, the feeling, and as you also said, the validation of, seeing your book in both places and really be like, yeah, I know what I'm talking about. I know this is a topic that I am passionate about, which leads to a second to last question before the final question. And that's this, James. Now, I know from your bio that you are an attorney by trade. That is your background. But how different would your life be personally if you did not pursue the creation of these books? If you did not write on rock and roll history, how different would your life be?
Yeah, man. I guess I'm probably kind of miserable. I think. I really felt a drive to do it, and if I enjoy law most of the time, but if I could write all day long, I would just do that, in a heartbeat. So it's really been something like it's hard to imagine a little bit. Like I'm going to put a lot of time and effort into it, and so it's just something I really felt compelled to do. Really, like if I'm not writing, I would be sitting around thinking about it. It's hard to even think about if I didn't pursue this. Yeah.
100% agree. And now this leads to the final question of this incredible interview, James, and that is this. So, with everything you've learned thus far with your first two books and writing the third book, what is your word of wisdom to fellow historians and fellow authors watching or listening to this interview right now?
If I have any wisdom, it would be so I guess one thing that somebody said to me a long time ago was about just writing in general, and they said, if you're not passionate about whatever it is, it's like you probably won't even finish whatever you're doing. And I feel sort of really lucky in a lot of ways, because like for me, that's been this history of rock. Like it's just something I'm passionate about, and so like it doesn't really seem a lot like work. It is, and it's a lot of time and effort, but it doesn't really seem like work because it's something I'm enjoying already. So I think finding something you're passionate about is crucial.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's like a big piece, because otherwise, if I'm writing about something I'm not really into, and it's probably going to be a chore.
Definitely. And going back to our audience and our readers, they're going to pick it up. They're going to see if you're really passionate about this topic, or if you're not. The language is going to be a telltale sign. So I 100% agree. You have to be passionate about something you're writing about, because if you're not passionate about it, most likely, as you said, James, you're not going to finish it, and it's going to be put to a side, which I cannot stress enough, my viewers and listeners who are listening to this. If you're writers, be passionate about the project that you are working on, and don't try to focus on being like anyone else. Just focus on you and your writing, because no one knows your writing or you better than you. And with that, we will end this incredible historians interview for the month of October. Thank you all so much for joining us for episode 2 for this month. And I want to give a huge thank you to our guest, Mr. James Cosby, for coming on the show and telling us all about his background as an independent historian, scholar, and attorney, as well as his 2 books. Now, James, where can people purchase a copy of your books, and where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out to learn more?
Yeah, both books, they're on all the usual social or websites, book websites. The publisher is McFarland. If you want to buy it directly from the publisher, which is always nice for the publisher. Yeah, otherwise, it's on Amazon and the usual places. And my social media, I'm on. I have a web page just for the 2 books. So if you look up Devil's Music, I just changed it to like Devil's Music, Rock Music. I think if you look up Devil's Music, Holy Rollers, it'll come up. That's what comes up. Or James Cosby, and then there's on Facebook. I just started on Facebook and have just kind of kept with it. So I do a little bit on Twitter, but not a lot.
All right. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you again so much for joining us for another episode here on the channel. And again, a huge thank you to Mr. James Cosby for coming on the show. James, thank you so very much for being here. And I wish you continued success with the 3rd book, and cannot wait to finish reading the book that you sent me, James. So thank you very much for that. And it's also, my viewers and listeners, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what was your favorite part about this interview. And as a bonus question, what is your favorite rock song or rock band? Comment down below in the description of this video. And as always, this is the Wandering Quill and Wandering Scribe signing off, wishing you a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world.